The crash echoed through our kitchen like a gunshot. My phone lay shattered across the tile floor, its screen splintered into 1,000 tiny mirrors reflecting the overhead light. Jessica stood over the wreckage, her nurse scrubs still crisp. From her shift at the hospital, her face twisted with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, almost cruel. "You won't be calling anyone tonight, Mom," she said, her voice carrying that professional tone she used with difficult patience. "Dad and I have decided what's best for you, and constantly bothering Aunt Carol isn't helping your condition." My condition. Those two words had become the chains that bound my life, the excuse for every freedom stripped away, every decision made without me. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd carried for 9 months, raised through scraped knees and broken hearts, put through nursing school with money from my own inheritance. When had Jessica become a stranger? I'm Linda Morrison, and 6 months ago, I was living what I thought was a perfectly normal life in Millfield, Oregon. I taught 3rd grade for 28 years before retiring early at 54, looking forward to finally having time for the garden I'd always dreamed of, the bee, novels I'd promised myself I'd read, the trips Tom and I had talked about taking. We had a comfortable life built on trust, routine, and what I believed was genuine love. Our daughter Jessica had just graduated nursing school and was working at the regional medical center. Tom's insurance business was thriving. We attended St. Matthew's every Sunday, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and were the kind of family people pointed to as having it all figured out. But standing in my kitchen that rainy October evening, watching my daughter clean up the pieces of my destroyed phone with the same methodical precision she'd used to clean up a medical emergency, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life had been carefully constructed lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first crack. In my perfect world had appeared 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was making coffee in our kitchen, the same ritual I'd performed thousands of times before, when I reached for my phone to call my sister Carol. We spoke every Tuesday morning, had for years. It was our time to catch up, complain about the Oregon rain, and share the small details that keep sisters connected across the miles between Millfield and her home in Phoenix. My phone wasn't where I'd left it on the counter. I searched the usual places, retracing my steps from the previous evening. Nothing. Finally, I found it tucked behind the coffee maker, a place I would never have put it. When I mentioned this to Tom over breakfast, he gave me that look, the one that had become increasingly familiar. Part concern, part pity, part something else I couldn't quite identify. "Honey, you put it there last night when you were cleaning up after dinner," he said gently, the way you'd speak to a confused child. "Don't you remember? You said you wanted to keep it away from the coffee spills." I didn't remember saying that. I didn't remember putting it there, but Tom seemed so certain, and he had no reason to lie about something so trivial. The seed of doubt he planted that morning would grow into a forest of confusion over the coming weeks. Jessica arrived that evening for our weekly dinner, a tradition we'd maintained since she'd moved into her own apartment across town. She was animated, telling us about her new job in the cardiac unit, her boyfriend Kevin, who worked at the pharmacy, her plans for the future. But when I mentioned the phone incident, her expression shifted to match her father's. "Mom, you've been more forgetful lately," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "At my graduation party, you introduced me to Mrs. Patterson 3 times. You asked Uncle Mike the same question about his retirement twice in one conversation. We're just worried about you." The graduation party. I tried to remember, but the details felt fuzzy around the edges. Had I really introduced Jessica multiple times? The doubt crept deeper, taking root in soil that Tom had been carefully preparing. Over the next few weeks, the incidents multiplied. Keys that weren't where I'd left them. Appointments. I was certain I'd never made appearing on the calendar Tom kept for us. Conversations people insisted we'd had that I couldn't recall. Each time, Tom and Jessica would exchange those looks, the ones that said they were sharing a burden I couldn't understand. "Maybe you should see someone," Tom suggested one evening as we sat in our living room, the rain pattering against the windows in the rhythm that defines Oregon autumns. "Dr. Foster specializes in memory issues. She's supposed to be excellent. Dr. Amanda Foster." The name would become central to everything that followed, though I wouldn't understand why for months. Tom made the appointment for me, drove me to what he said was her office, sat in what appeared to be a waiting room while I supposedly met with her. I say supposedly because looking back now, I'm not entirely sure what happened during those sessions. I remember filling out forms, answering questions, taking tests, but the details remain frustratingly vague, like trying to remember a dream the morning after. What I do remember clearly is the diagnosis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Early onset dementia with progressive memory loss and episodes of confusion. Dr. Foster, according to Tom, had been very concerned about my condition. The medication she prescribed would help slow the progression, but I would need increased supervision and support. Most importantly, I shouldn't try to manage complex tasks like banking or driving without assistance. Jessica cried when Tom told her. Real tears that streaked down her cheeks as she hugged me in our living room, promising that she and her father would take care of everything. I should have felt comforted by their love and concern. Instead, something deep in my gut whispered that things weren't right, a whisper I tried desperately to ignore. The changes came gradually but systematically. Tom took over our finances completely, explaining that managing money had become too stressful for me. He installed new software on my computer and phone, supposedly to help me remember appointments and stay organized, but I noticed it tracked everything I did online. Jessica began calling every morning and evening to check on me. Conversations that felt more like interrogations disguised as concern. "How are you feeling today, Mom? Did you remember to take your medication? What did you have for lunch? Are you sure? You told me yesterday you'd make a sandwich, but Dad said he found the bread still on the counter when he got home." The isolation was subtle but effective. Friends from church received calls from Tom explaining that I was having a difficult time and might not be up for visitors. My book club was told I'd decided to take a break from meetings. Even my weekly grocery shopping trips became supervised expeditions with Jessica, who insisted on pushing the cart and making sure I didn't get confused or overwhelmed. But the worst part was the way I began to doubt myself. When your own family, the people who love you most, consistently tell you that your memory is failing, that your perceptions are unreliable, that your concerns are symptoms of illness rather than legitimate observations, you start to believe them. The human mind desperately wants to trust the people closest to it, even when that trust is being systematically weaponized against you. The financial aspects of my life became completely opaque. When I asked to see statements from my family, farm trust, the inheritance from my parents that had always been my security blanket, Tom would patiently explain that we'd already discussed this, that the money was safely invested, that I shouldn't worry about such complicated matters in my condition. When I pressed for details, he'd grow concerned about my agitation levels and suggest I take the calming medication Dr. Foster had prescribed. That medication made everything worse. It left me feeling foggy and disconnected, like I was living my life through thick glass. Simple tasks became monumentally difficult. Conversations required enormous effort to follow. The woman I'd been, the sharp teacher who could manage 33rd graders while simultaneously tracking their academic progress and emotional needs, was disappearing piece by piece. But even in my medicated haze, some part of me remained alert, watching, questioning. When Tom thought I was napping, I'd hear phone conversations conducted in hushed tones. When Jessica visited, she'd sometimes slip into the home office and close the door, emerging with file folders that she'd quickly hide when she saw me. There were inconsistencies in their stories, small details that didn't align, explanations that changed depending on when and how I asked about them. The first real proof that something was wrong came by accident. I was looking for a pen in Tom's desk drawer when I found a receipt from a restaurant in Portland, dated from a day he'd told me he was handling an insurance claim in Eugene. The receipt was for 2 dinners, but Tom had supposedly been working alone. When I asked him about it, he looked genuinely surprised before quickly explaining that he'd taken a client to dinner as part of the claim process. But his surprise in that split second before the explanation told me he hadn't expected me to find that receipt. I began paying attention in ways I hadn't before, fighting through the medication fog to notice details. Tom's supposed late nights at the office seemed to follow a pattern. The mysterious phone calls always happened when he thought I was sleeping or out of the house. Bank statements that used to arrive monthly had stopped coming altogether. When I asked about them, Tom explained that he'd switched to online statements to help reduce my confusion with paperwork. But the most disturbing discovery was purely accidental. I was cleaning out my jewelry box when I found a small notebook tucked behind the felt lining, a notebook I'd never seen before. In Tom's handwriting were dates and observations about my behavior. Linda confused about appointment time. Perfect. Example of memory loss. Linda insisted she'd left keys on counter, found them in unusual location, shows spatial disorientation. Linda's sister called. Linda seemed agitated after conversation, demonstrates emotional instability. Each entry was dated and detailed, like a clinical record of my deterioration. But reading them, I realized they described incidents from Tom's perspective. Incidents where he'd been the one to point out my confusion, to find my misplaced items, to suggest that my reactions were inappropriate or symptomatic. The notebook was a record of orchestrated events designed to document a condition that might not actually exist. That night, I lay awake listening to Tom's steady breathing beside me, my mind racing despite the medication that was supposed to calm me. If Tom was documenting my symptoms, and if some of those symptoms were situations he'd created or manipulated, then what else might be fabricated? The thought was so terrifying and so contrary to everything I believed about my marriage and family that I tried to push it away. But once the possibility had entered my mind, it began to reshape everything else. I started testing my own memory more carefully, writing down conversations and events in a small journal that I hid behind books on my bedroom bookshelf. I began to notice discrepancies between what I remembered and what Tom and Jessica told me had happened. Small things at first, but they added up to a pattern that suggested my memory wasn't as faulty as everyone insisted. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when I decided to call my sister Carol from the landline in our bedroom, something I hadn't done in weeks because Tom had convinced me that the calls upset me and made my condition worse. Carol answered on the second ring, and her voice was filled with relief and concern. "Linda, thank God," she said. "I've been so worried. Tom called me last month and said you were having a really hard time, that talking to me seemed to agitate you, and that maybe I should give you some space to focus on your treatment. But I've been thinking about you every day." Treatment. Tom had told Carol I was in treatment, but he'd never mentioned speaking to her about it. According to him, Carol was too far away to understand the situation, and it would be better not to worry her with details. Yet he'd been managing our relationship behind my back, using my supposed condition to isolate me from my strongest support system. "Carol," I said, keeping my voice low even though Tom was supposedly at the office. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. When we talked on my birthday 3 months ago, did I seem confused or forgetful? To you?" There was a long pause. "Your birthday? Linda, we didn't talk on your birthday. I tried calling you twice, but Tom answered and said you were having a bad day and couldn't come to the phone. I sent you a card, but I never heard back. I assumed you weren't feeling well enough to call. My birthday. Tom had told me that Carol had called, that we'd had a lovely conversation, but that I'd seemed tired and confused during the call. He'd used that supposed conversation as evidence of my declining condition, proof that even my sister had noticed my symptoms. But the conversation had never happened. Sitting on my bed with the phone pressed to my ear, I felt the last pieces of my trust in Tom and Jessica crumble. If they were lying about conversations with Carol, if they were manipulating my relationship with my sister, then what else were they lying about? The medical diagnosis, the financial management, the need for supervision and medication, all of it could be part of an elaborate deception designed to achieve some goal I couldn't yet understand. But understanding would come sooner than I expected, in the most devastating way possible. That evening, as I stood in our kitchen trying to process everything I'd learned, trying to figure out how to verify my suspicions without alerting Tom and Jessica to my investigation, I made the mistake of reaching for my phone to call Carol back. I needed to hear her voice again, needed to confirm that what she'd told me was real and not another trick of my supposedly failing mind. Jessica had arrived for dinner, still in her scrubs from the hospital, chatting with Tom about her day while I prepared our meal. She was describing a difficult patient when she noticed me picking up my phone. "Mom, what are you doing?" Her voice carried that sharp, professional tone she used when patients weren't following medical orders. "I wanted to call Aunt Carol," I said, not thinking about how this would sound to them. We had such a nice conversation earlier. The look that passed between Tom and Jessica was electric, charged with something I couldn't identify but recognized as dangerous. Tom stepped closer, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused concern. "Honey, you talked to Carol? When?" His voice was gentle, but I could hear the tension underneath. "This afternoon, while you were at work." I held my phone closer, suddenly protective of it in a way that surprised me. Jessica moved faster than I expected. Her hand shot out and grabbed my phone before I could react, her fingers wrapping around it with the same firm grip she'd used to restrain an agitated patient. "Mom, you're confused again," she said, her voice taking on that patient, condescending tone that had become so familiar. "You couldn't have talked to Aunt Carol this afternoon. Dad called me at work to check on you, and you were napping. You've been having these episodes where you think conversations happened that didn't actually occur." "That's not true," I said, reaching for my phone. I spoke to her. We talked about my birthday, about how Tom told her I couldn't come to the phone. Jessica pulled the phone away from my outstretched hand, and that's when something inside me snapped. The months of doubt, the systematic erosion of my reality, the constant questioning of my own perceptions, all of it crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. I knew what I'd experienced. I knew that conversation with Carol had been real. And I knew that Jessica and Tom were lying to me. "Give me my phone, Jessica." My voice was steadier than I felt. "Mom, you're getting agitated. This is exactly what Dr. Foster warned us about. These false memories can seem completely real to you, but acting on them isn't healthy." I reached for the phone again, and that's when Jessica lost her careful composure. Her face contorted with frustration and something that looked like panic. She raised her arm and brought my phone down hard against the kitchen floor. The crash seemed to echo forever in our suddenly silent kitchen. The three of us stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces of my connection to the outside world. Then Jessica looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Cold, calculating, almost cruel. "You won't be calling anyone tonight, Mom. Dad and I have decided what's best for you, and constantly bothering Aunt Carol isn't helping your condition." In that moment, standing in my own kitchen surrounded by the shattered remains of my phone, I finally understood what was happening to me. This wasn't about my health or my memory or my well-being. This was about control and money, and something so calculating and deliberate that it took my breath away. Tom stepped forward, his face a mask of concerned sympathy that I now recognized as completely fake. "Let's not upset yourself further, Linda. Jessica's right. These episodes are becoming more frequent, and we need to consider what's best for your safety and health." But I was done being gaslit, done accepting their version of reality, done questioning my own perceptions and memories. The conversation with Carol had been real. The notebook in Tom's handwriting was real. The lies they'd been telling me for months were real. And tomorrow, I was going to disappear. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of our old house, every shift of Tom's breathing beside me, every distant sound from the street outside seemed amplified in the darkness. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything that had led to this moment. The woman I had been 6 months ago felt like a stranger now, someone naive and trusting who had walked blindly into a carefully constructed trap. I thought about the Linda Morrison who had retired from teaching with such optimism, looking forward to lazy mornings with coffee and novels, afternoons spent cultivating the garden I'd dreamed about for decades. That woman had believed in the goodness of people, especially the people closest to her. She had trusted without question, loved without reservation, and never imagined that the very qualities that made her a good teacher, wife, and mother could be turned against her with such precision. Jessica had always been my pride and joy, the daughter who brought home perfect report cards and volunteered at the animal shelter, who chose nursing because she wanted to help people heal. She was the child who would climb into my lap during thunderstorms, who called me every day during her first semester of college because she missed our conversations, who had asked me to help her pick out her engagement ring when she thought Kevin was going to propose. When had that loving, open-hearted girl become someone who could look me in the eye and lie with such conviction? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Looking back now, I could see the subtle shifts that had occurred over the past year. Phone conversations that became shorter and more superficial. Visits that felt more like obligations than genuine connection. Questions about my health and memory that seemed to focus more on documenting problems than expressing concern. Jessica had been studying for her nursing boards during the period when Tom first started expressing worries about my mental state, and I realized now that she might have been learning about dementia symptoms at the same time Tom was manufacturing them in our daily life. Tom stirred beside me, and I forced my breathing to remain deep and even, feigning the sleep that eluded me. In the dim light filtering through our bedroom curtains, I studied his profile. This man I had shared a bed with for 28 years. His face in sleep looked peaceful, almost innocent, nothing like the calculating manipulator I was beginning to understand him to be. We had met when I was 26 and he was 28, both of us ready to build something stable and lasting together. I had been teaching at Millfield Elementary for 3 years, and he had just started his insurance business with a small office downtown and big dreams about expanding throughout the region. Our courtship had been traditional and comfortable. Tom was reliable, ambitious, and respected in our small community. He brought me flowers on our dates, opened doors, and talked about wanting a family and a house with a white picket fence. He seemed like everything a sensible young woman should want in a husband, and I had convinced myself that the quiet contentment I felt with him was the same as the passionate love I read about in novels. When he proposed on Christmas Eve in front of my parents' fireplace, it felt like the natural next step in a life that was unfolding exactly as it should. The early years of our marriage had been genuinely happy, or at least I thought they had been. Tom's business grew steadily, and we bought the house on Maple Street where we still lived, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with good bones and a large backyard perfect for the children we planned to have. When Jessica was born, after 2 years of trying, Tom had been a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with her during those long newborn nights when she wouldn't sleep. But there had always been signs of his need for control, patterns I had interpreted as care and protectiveness, rather than manipulation. Tom managed all our finances from the beginning, explaining that it was more efficient for one person to handle the bills and investments. He made decisions about major purchases and home improvements, consulting me but somehow always getting his way in the end. When we socialized, he often answered questions directed at me, speaking for both of us in ways that seemed natural at the time, but now felt like systematic silencing. The control had been subtle enough that I never recognized it as problematic. Tom never raised his voice or made dramatic demands. Instead, he used reason and logic, concern for my well-being, and gentle suggestions that somehow always became reality. When I wanted to go back to school for my master's degree, he worried about the stress it would put on our family finances and my time with Jessica. When I considered applying for a principal position at another school, he reminded me how much Jessica needed stability and how much our community meant to us. Each time, his arguments seemed reasonable and loving, focused on what was best for our family rather than what I wanted for myself. Looking back, I could see how systematically he had shaped my world to revolve around his needs and desires while making me believe it was my choice. The friends we socialized with were primarily his business associates and their wives. The vacations we took were to places that interested him or served his professional networking goals. Even the church we attended had been his selection, chosen, more for the business connections it offered than for spiritual reasons. I had adapted and accommodated so gradually that I never noticed how small my independent life had become. The inheritance from my parents' farm had been the turning point, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. When my father died 5 years ago, followed by my mother 18 months later, they left me the family property that had been in our family for 3 generations. The farm itself had been sold years earlier, but the trust fund established from the sale was substantial, nearly $1 million that represented my family's legacy and my personal security. Tom had been excited about the inheritance, immediately full of ideas about how to invest it and make it grow. He had suggested rolling it into our joint accounts where he could manage it alongside our other investments, but something had made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way he talked about the money as if it were already his, or maybe it was some instinct I didn't consciously recognize. For whatever reason, I had insisted on keeping the trust separate, with myself as the primary beneficiary and Jessica as the secondary heir. The decision had created the first real tension in our marriage, though Tom had been careful not to express his frustration directly. Instead, he had worried about the complexity of managing separate accounts, the tax implications, the burden it would place on me to track another investment portfolio. He had volunteered to handle the paperwork and oversight as a favor to me, to reduce my stress and ensure the money was properly managed. But I had held firm, working with the trust's financial advisor independently and receiving quarterly statements that I reviewed personally. Now I wondered if that decision had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Tom's business had been struggling in recent years as larger insurance companies moved into our region and competed for his clients. There had been stress about money, careful budgeting, and discussions about potentially downsizing our house or my retiring earlier than planned to reduce our expenses. The inheritance had seemed like a solution to our financial pressures, but only if Tom could access it. A legally declared mental incompetency would change everything. If I were deemed unable to manage my own affairs, Tom would likely be appointed as my guardian, giving him complete control over my inheritance as well as all other aspects of my life. The fake medical diagnosis, the systematic documentation of my supposed symptoms, the isolation from family and friends who might question his narrative, all of it served the same goal: establishing a legal case for my incompetency that would transfer my assets to his control. But there was something else, something I sensed but couldn't quite grasp yet. The notebook I'd found in Tom's desk had mentioned conversations and incidents I didn't remember, but it had also contained references to appointments and meetings that seemed to extend beyond simple documentation. There were phone numbers without names, dates circled on a calendar that didn't correspond to anything in our normal routine, and references to Phase 2 that suggested this was all part of a larger plan with multiple stages. Tom's breathing changed, becoming lighter and more irregular, and I realized he was waking up. I quickly closed my eyes and forced my body to relax, maintaining the pretense of sleep while he stirred beside me. I felt him turn toward me, studying my face in the dim light, and it took all my self-control not to react to his scrutiny. After what felt like an eternity, he slipped quietly out of bed and padded across the room to our bathroom. Through barely opened eyelids, I watched him close the bathroom door and saw the sliver of light appear underneath it. This was my chance to do something I'd been planning since finding his notebook. Moving as silently as possible, I slipped out of bed and crept to his side of the room, where his clothes from the previous day lay draped over a chair. His pants pockets yielded nothing unusual, but his jacket contained his work phone, a device he always kept separate from his personal cell phone. I had watched Tom enter his work phone passcode countless times over the years, the same 4 digits he used for most of his passwords, Jessica's birth year. The phone unlocked immediately, and I quickly navigated to his text messages, my heart pounding as I scrolled through conversations with clients and business associates. Most of the messages were routine, discussions about claims and policy renewals, but one conversation thread made my blood run cold. The contact was listed simply as S, and the messages went back several months. "Linda's episodes are becoming more frequent," Tom had written in one text. "The medication seems to be helping with compliance, but she's still having moments of clarity that are problematic." The response from S had been brief. "Increase the dosage gradually. Too much too fast will raise suspicions." I scrolled further up in the conversation, finding messages that revealed the scope of what was happening. To me, "Financial advisor meeting went well," Tom had written. "Documentation is solid. Timeline looks feasible if current progress continues." And later, "Need to accelerate isolation protocols. Sister becoming suspicious of reduced contact." The bathroom door handle turned, and I quickly returned Tom's phone to his jacket pocket and slipped back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin and forcing my breathing to slow. Tom emerged from the bathroom and stood in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against the light. I could feel him watching me, and I concentrated on maintaining the steady rhythm of sleep breathing while my mind raced with the implications of what I'd discovered. Tom wasn't acting alone. The mysterious S was clearly involved in planning and implementing my systematic drugging and manipulation. The references to medication dosages and compliance suggested that someone with medical knowledge was involved, someone who understood how to use pharmaceuticals to create the symptoms of cognitive decline without causing obvious harm. The carefully planned timeline and documentation indicated that this was a long-term scheme with specific goals and benchmarks. When Tom finally returned to bed, I lay frozen beside him, acutely aware of every movement and sound he made. The man sleeping next to me wasn't just betraying our marriage and stealing my inheritance. He was systematically destroying my mind and my identity with the help of at least one other person, possibly more. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than I had imagined, and the realization left me feeling simultaneously terrified and strangely relieved. Terrified because the level of planning and coordination involved suggested that this wasn't an impulsive crime, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been in development for months, possibly years. The fact that Tom had accomplices meant that even if I could prove what was happening to me, I would be facing multiple people who had invested significant time and effort in making me appear mentally incompetent. But I was also relieved because the existence of text messages and documented communications meant that there was evidence of the conspiracy, proof that this wasn't all in my head or the product of actual mental illness. The messages I'd seen on Tom's phone were concrete evidence that my suspicions were justified, that the gaslighting and manipulation were real and deliberate. For the first time in months, I felt completely certain that my perceptions were accurate and my memories were reliable. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather for Western Oregon. Tom was already up and moving around the house when I woke, and I could hear him in the kitchen making coffee and preparing for his day. I lay in bed for a few extra minutes, gathering my strength for the performance I would need to maintain while secretly planning my escape. When I finally joined him in the kitchen, Tom was sitting at our small table with his laptop open, reviewing what appeared to be insurance files while eating toast and reading the news on his tablet. He looked up when I entered, his expression shifting into the concerned, protective mask I'd grown to recognize. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" he asked, closing his laptop and giving me his full attention. "You seemed restless last night. I was wondering if we should call Dr. Foster about adjusting your sleep medication." Dr. Foster, the mysterious physician whose existence I was beginning to seriously question. In all my supposed appointments with her, I had never received a business card, never seen her medical license displayed in her office, never been given direct contact information for her practice. All communication went through Tom, who scheduled my appointments and received her recommendations for my treatment. "I'm feeling fine," I said, keeping my voice steady and mild. "Just had some strange dreams. Nothing to worry about." Tom nodded, but I could see him making a mental note of my response, filing it away as either evidence of my condition or a sign that his current approach was working. The realization that every conversation with my husband was actually a form of data collection made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to maintain normal behavior while my mind worked furiously on my escape plan. The plan was already forming, built on resources and knowledge Tom didn't know I possessed. Years of teaching had made me good at reading people and situations, skills that were serving me well now as I analyzed the patterns of control and manipulation that had been imposed on my life. Teachers learn to be observers, to notice when a child is struggling or hiding something, to recognize the signs of problems at home that kids try to conceal. Those same observational skills were now helping me understand how systematically my reality had been distorted. More importantly, my years in education had connected me with a network of people Tom didn't know about or had forgotten existed. Former colleagues who had retired to other parts of the state, parents of students I'd taught who had moved away but maintained contact, professional organizations and friendships that existed outside of Millfield's small social circle. These connections represented potential allies and resources that existed beyond Tom's ability to monitor or control. I spent the morning maintaining my usual routine while secretly making preparations. When Tom left for his office, I retrieved a small amount of cash I'd been gradually accumulating from grocery shopping, hiding $20 here and there over the past few weeks. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for immediate needs if I had to leave quickly. I also gathered important documents that I could access: my driver's license, social security card, and a credit card Tom didn't know about, one I'd kept active, with a small automatic payment that was deducted from my separate checking account. The credit card was a relic from my teaching days, something I'd originally obtained for school-related purchases and had simply never canceled when I retired. The monthly fee was automatically deducted from the checking account I'd maintained independently, and the statements went to my email address rather than our home. It wasn't much of a financial resource, but it represented independence and mobility that Tom couldn't immediately cut off. By the time Jessica arrived for lunch, a surprise visit she announced with a cheerful text message, I had made my decision. Today would be my last day in this house. My last day pretending to be the confused, declining woman they needed me to be. Tomorrow I would disappear, and when I returned, it would be with evidence and allies that would expose everything they had done to me. Jessica bustled into the kitchen with her usual energy, still in her scrubs from her morning shift at the hospital. She kissed my cheek and began chattering about her patients while she made us both sandwiches, her movements efficient and familiar in our kitchen. Watching her, I felt a profound sadness for the relationship we had lost, the genuine connection that had been corrupted by Tom's manipulation and whatever hold he had over her. "You seem better today, Mom," she said, handing me a plate and settling into the chair across from me. "More like yourself. Are you sleeping better with the new medication dosage? New medication dosage. I hadn't been aware that anything had changed, but apparently adjustments were being made without my knowledge or consent. The casual way Jessica mentioned it confirmed my growing suspicion that she was more involved in the medical aspects of my supposed treatment than I had realized. I suppose so, I said carefully, though I'm not always sure what I'm taking or why. Sometimes I feel like I should understand my own treatment better. Jessica's expression grew concerned, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Mom, we've talked about this. Dr. Foster explained that too much focus on the medical details can create anxiety that makes your symptoms worse. Dad and I are keeping track of everything for you so you don't have to worry about it. The patronizing tone was so gentle and loving that it would have been easy to accept, to let myself be cared for and protected by people who claim to love me. But I could see now how the language of care had been weaponized against me, how genuine medical concerns had been twisted into tools of control and manipulation. After Jessica left, promising to check on me again tomorrow, I sat alone in my kitchen and made my final preparations. I wrote a letter that I placed on my bedside table, explaining that I needed some time away to think and that I would be in touch when I was ready. The letter was deliberately vague, giving no indication of where I was going or what I suspected, but it would serve as proof that my disappearance was voluntary rather than the result of confusion or a medical emergency. Then I picked up our landline phone and made a call I should have made months ago to the one person I knew I could trust completely to help me uncover the truth about what was happening to my life. Carol, I said when my sister answered, keeping my voice low even though I was alone in the house. It's Linda. I need your help, and I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Carol's voice on the other end of the line was instantly alert, cutting through whatever she had been doing to focus completely on my words. My sister had always possessed an uncanny ability to read my emotional state through the smallest changes in my tone, a skill developed over 54 years of being each other's closest confidant. Even though we lived in different states now, separated by the breadth of the American West, that connection remained as strong as ever. Linda, what's wrong? You sound terrified, she said, and I could hear her moving around her house in Phoenix, probably closing doors and finding a private space where she could give me her full attention. I took a deep breath and began to tell her everything. The forgetfulness that wasn't really forgetfulness. The medications that made me feel disconnected from my own mind. The systematic isolation from friends and family that had been disguised as medical necessity. I told her about the notebook I'd found in Tom's desk, documenting my supposed symptoms with clinical precision. I described the text messages I'd discovered on his work phone, revealing a conspiracy that involved at least one other person with medical knowledge. Most importantly, I told her about the conversation we'd supposedly had on my birthday, the one Tom had used as evidence of my declining mental state, the conversation that had never actually taken place. Carol listened without interruption, her silence on the other end of the line both comforting and ominous. When I finally finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. Linda, I've been worried about this for months, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Not just the birthday call, but the way Tom has been managing my contact with you. Every time I've tried to arrange a visit, he's had a reason why it wouldn't be good for your health. When I've called and you weren't available, his explanations seemed reasonable at the time, but looking back, there was always something that felt off about them. She paused, and I could hear her taking notes, the scratch of pen on paper that told me she was treating this with the systematic approach that had made her successful in her career as a legal paralegal. There's something else, Carol continued. About 6 weeks ago, I received a call from someone claiming to be from Dr. Foster's office, asking about your family medical history. They said they needed information about hereditary conditions that might be relevant to your treatment. I gave them information about Mom's arthritis and Dad's heart condition, but afterward, I realized they never asked me for any verification of my identity. They just assumed I was who I said I was when I answered your emergency contact number. The implications of this hit me like a physical blow. Not only were Tom and his accomplices manufacturing evidence of my mental decline, but they were actively gathering information to make their false narrative more convincing. By collecting family medical history, they could create a more believable story about hereditary factors contributing to my supposed dementia. "Carol, I need to get out of here," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the fear coursing through me. "Tomorrow morning, Tom will be at his tennis game, and Jessica won't check on me until the afternoon. I can leave then, but I need somewhere to go, somewhere they won't think to look for me." "Come to Phoenix," Carol said immediately. "I'll buy you a plane ticket right now. Fly into Sky Harbor and I'll pick you up." The offer was tempting, but I shook my head even though she couldn't see me. "That's too obvious. Tom knows we're close, and Arizona would be one of the first places he'd look. Besides, I can't just run away and hide. I need to gather evidence, find allies, build a case that will expose what they're doing to me." Carol was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There's another option," she said finally. "I have a friend in Oregon, someone I worked with years ago, who moved up there for a job. Rachel Torres. She's a private investigator now, specializes in cases involving elder abuse and financial exploitation. She's discreet, thorough, and she has connections throughout the Pacific Northwest. A private investigator. The possibility of professional help, someone with the skills and resources to uncover the truth about what was happening to me, felt like the first real hope I'd experienced in months. "Can you contact her?" I asked. "Set up a meeting somewhere Tom wouldn't think to look?" "I'll call her tonight," Carol promised. "Give me your meeting preferences and I'll coordinate everything. But Linda, you need to be careful. If Tom is as calculating as you're describing, he's not going to just let you walk away. He'll have contingency plans." After we ended the call, I spent the rest of the evening maintaining the pretense of normalcy while my mind raced with the details of my escape plan. Tom returned from work at his usual time, and we had dinner together while he told me about his day handling insurance claims and meeting with clients. His casual conversation felt surreal, knowing what I now understood about his true activities, like watching a skilled actor perform a role he'd been rehearsing for months. "I have an early tennis game tomorrow," he mentioned as we cleaned up the dinner dishes. "Coach wants to work on my backhand before the weather gets too cold for outdoor courts. I'll probably be gone until 10 or 11. Perfect. Tom's Saturday morning tennis routine was one of the few constants in his schedule, something he never missed regardless of other commitments. His absence would give me a 3-hour window to execute my plan without worrying about him returning. Unexpectedly. That night, I lay awake listening to Tom's breathing, marking time until I could be certain he was deeply asleep. Around 2 a.m, I slipped out of bed and made my final preparations. I packed a small overnight bag with essential items, being careful to choose things that wouldn't be immediately missed. I gathered the documents I would need and secured them in a folder that I could carry easily. Most importantly, I retrieved the evidence I'd been collecting: photographs of the notebook from Tom's desk, screenshots from his phone that I'd managed to capture, and notes about incidents and conversations that proved my memory was reliable. The hardest part was writing the letter I would leave on my bedside table. It needed to explain my absence without revealing my suspicions or plans, giving me time to gather allies and evidence before Tom realized the scope of what I'd discovered. I wrote several drafts before settling on something deliberately vague, but believable. "Tom, I need some time to think about my health and our future. I'm going to stay with a friend for a few days to clear my head and consider my options. Please don't worry about me or try to find me. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to talk, Linda." The letter was true enough to be convincing, but misleading enough to buy me the time I needed. Tom would assume I was confused and possibly dangerous to myself, which would justify calling the police and reporting me as a missing person with dementia. But it would also suggest that I was still capable of planning and executing travel, which might delay the immediate assumption that I was completely incompetent. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made Oregon's reputation for natural beauty well-deserved. Tom left for his tennis game at 7:30, kissing me goodbye and reminding me to take my morning medication with breakfast. I waited until I was certain his car was gone before moving into action. The medication he'd referenced sat on our kitchen counter in a small plastic organizer marked with the days of the week. I had been taking these pills faithfully for months, trusting that they were helping with the memory and confusion issues that everyone insisted I was experiencing. Now, looking at them with clear eyes, I realized I had no idea what they actually contained or whether they were necessary for any legitimate medical condition. Instead of taking them, I emptied the contents of several days' worth of pills into a small envelope that I tucked into my purse. If Rachel Torres was as good as Carol claimed, she would be able to have them analyzed and determine what I'd been consuming and in what quantities. By 8:15, I was walking out of my house with my overnight bag and purse, heading for the bus stop 6 blocks away that would take me to the Regional Transportation Center. I had deliberately chosen public transportation over driving my own car, knowing that Tom could track my movements through credit card purchases at gas stations and electronic toll systems. The bus would leave a much smaller digital footprint and would be harder for him to trace. The regional center was a modest hub that served several small towns in our area, offering connections to larger cities like Portland and Eugene. From there, I could access additional transportation options that would make my movements even harder to track. But first, I needed to get to Brookstone, a town about 40 minutes away where Carol had arranged for me to meet Rachel Torres. The bus ride gave me time to think about the conversation I'd had with Carol and the connections she'd begun to draw between seemingly unrelated incidents. The fake call from Dr. Foster's office requesting family medical history was particularly troubling because it suggested a level of planning and sophistication that went far beyond simple financial fraud. Someone was building a comprehensive medical case against me, creating documentation that would support a legal finding of mental incompetence. But there was something else nagging at me, a memory that had been triggered by Carol's mention of the medical history inquiry. Several months ago, Tom had suggested that we update our wills and estate planning documents, claiming that changes in tax law made it advisable to review our arrangements. I had agreed without much thought, trusting his judgment about financial and legal matters as I always had. The attorney who had handled the updates was someone Tom had chosen, a lawyer I'd never met before who had come to our house for the signing. At the time, this had seemed like a convenience, but now I wondered if there was another reason Tom hadn't wanted me to visit a law office where I might have spoken privately with the attorney or other staff members. The documents I'd signed had been complex, full of legal language that the attorney had explained quickly while emphasizing that they were routine updates to reflect current best practices. I had signed where indicated, trusting that Tom and the lawyer had my best interests in mind. Now I wondered what exactly I had agreed to, and whether those documents contained provisions that would make it easier for Tom to gain control of my assets if I were declared incompetent. The bus pulled into Brookstone's small downtown area at 9:45, giving me 15 minutes to find the coffee shop where I was supposed to meet Rachel Torres. Brookstone was larger than Millfield, but still small enough that Main Street constituted the primary commercial district. The coffee shop was easy to find, a locally owned establishment with mismatched furniture and the kind of comfortable atmosphere that encouraged people to linger over their drinks. I ordered tea and found a table near the back where I could watch the entrance while remaining somewhat inconspicuous. At exactly 10 o'clock, a woman entered who immediately caught my attention. She was perhaps 45 years old, with short dark hair and the kind of alert, observant expression that suggested she was constantly analyzing her environment. She scanned the coffee shop systematically before her eyes settled on me with unmistakable recognition. Rachel Torres approached my table with confident strides, extending her hand as she introduced herself. "Linda Morrison, I presume," Your sister has told me quite a bit about your situation." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested both competence and trustworthiness. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice. I wasn't sure who else to turn to." Rachel settled into the chair across from me and pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a fresh page before looking up at me with focused attention. "Carol gave me the basic outline, but I'd like to hear the details directly from you. Start wherever you feel comfortable, and don't worry about chronological order. We can sort out the timeline later." For the next hour, I told Rachel everything. I could remember about the gradual changes in my life over the past several months. She listened with the kind of professional attention that made me feel heard and believed in a way I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. She asked clarifying questions at key points, but mostly let me tell my story without interruption. When I finished, Rachel reviewed her notes for a few minutes before looking up at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and grimly determined. "Linda, what you're describing is a sophisticated form of psychological abuse combined with what appears to be a long-term financial fraud scheme," she said. "The systematic gaslighting, the isolation from support systems, the fake medical diagnosis, all of it points to a coordinated effort to establish legal grounds for declaring you mentally incompetent." She paused, tapping her pen against her notebook as she organized her thoughts. "The involvement of someone with medical knowledge, evidenced by the text messages you saw about medication dosages, suggests that this goes beyond simple husband and wife fraud. You're dealing with a conspiracy that likely involves multiple people with different areas of expertise." The confirmation of my suspicions was both relieving and terrifying. Relieving because it validated my perceptions and proved that I wasn't actually losing my mind. Terrifying because it meant I was up against people who had invested significant time, effort, and resources in destroying my life for their own benefit. "What kind of evidence do we need to prove this?" I asked. "And how do we get it without alerting them to what we're doing?" Rachel smiled for the first time since we'd met, an expression that suggested she was looking forward to the challenge ahead. "That's where my particular skill set becomes useful. I specialize in cases exactly like this, and I've developed methods for gathering evidence without tipping off the perpetrators." She explained that financial fraud cases often required multiple types of evidence: documentation of the fraudulent activities themselves, proof of the methods used to establish the victim's supposed incompetence, and evidence of coordination between the various participants in the scheme. In my case, this would mean analyzing the medications I'd been given, investigating the credentials of Dr. Foster, tracing financial transactions related to my inheritance, and identifying Tom's accomplices. "The text messages you photographed are an excellent start," Rachel said, "but we'll need more comprehensive communications records to establish the full scope of the conspiracy. We'll also need to document your actual mental state through independent medical evaluation, proving that your cognitive abilities are normal and that any symptoms you've experienced were artificially induced." She outlined a plan that would take several days to execute, but would provide the comprehensive evidence needed to expose the scheme and protect me from further abuse. The plan would require me to remain hidden while she conducted her investigation, giving Tom and his accomplices the impression that I was simply a confused woman who had wandered away from home. "There's one more thing," Rachel said as we prepared to leave the coffee shop. "Carol mentioned that you have an inheritance that's likely the target of this scheme. We need to secure that money immediately before Tom can find a way to access it through legal channels." The inheritance. In all my focus on the personal betrayal and psychological abuse, I had almost forgotten that the ultimate goal was probably financial. My parents' farm trust represented nearly $1 million, money that Tom couldn't access as long as I remained legally competent, but that would become his to control if I were declared mentally incompetent. "I have some control over the trust," I said, "but I haven't accessed it in months. Tom convinced me that it was better to let it grow without interference." Rachel nodded grimly. We need to contact the trust administrator immediately and put additional security measures in place. If Tom is planning to have you declared incompetent, he's probably already been in contact with them, laying groundwork for taking control of the account. As we left the coffee shop together, I felt a mixture of hope and apprehension that I hadn't experienced in months. Hope because I finally had professional help and a concrete plan for fighting back against the people who had been systematically destroying my life. Apprehension because I was beginning to understand the full scope of what I was up against and the risks involved in challenging people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use sophisticated manipulation and fraud to achieve their goals. Rachel drove me to a small motel on the outskirts of town where she had reserved a room under a false name. The location was isolated enough to provide privacy for our continued planning, but close enough to transportation that I could leave quickly if necessary. "I'll be in touch with updates as my investigation progresses," she said as we parted ways. "In the meantime, stay here and don't contact anyone except Carol and me. Tom will be looking for you, and he'll be monitoring your usual communication channels." Alone in the motel room, I finally allowed myself to fully process everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. Less than a day ago, I had been a woman trapped in her own home, doubting her own perceptions and memories, isolated from everyone who might have been able to help her. Now I was free, hidden but safe, with professional allies working to expose the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life. But I also understood that the hardest part was still ahead. Tom wouldn't simply accept my disappearance as the confused wandering of a mentally ill woman. He would search for me, and when he couldn't find me, he would escalate his efforts to establish my incompetence through legal channels. The window of time I had to gather evidence and build a case against him was limited, and the stakes couldn't be higher. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped until I realized it was from Carol, not Tom. "Spoke with Rachel. You're in good hands. Stay strong, and remember that you're not alone in this fight anymore." I wasn't alone. After months of isolation and manipulation, after being made to doubt my own sanity and cut off from everyone who cared about me, I finally had allies who believed in me and were willing to fight for the truth. The battle ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had a real chance of winning it. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspended reality at the Brookstone Motel. I existed in a liminal space between my old life and whatever would come next, waiting for Rachel's investigation to unfold while trying to process the magnitude of betrayal I'd uncovered. The room was Spartan but clean, with thin walls that carried the sounds of other guests coming and going, their normal lives continuing while mine hung in the balance. Rachel called twice daily with updates, her professional demeanor gradually warming as she uncovered layer after layer of evidence supporting my accusations. The medications I'd been taking contained a combination of benzodiazepines and antihistamines in doses calculated to cause confusion and memory problems without triggering obvious medical emergencies. The analysis confirmed what I'd suspected. I had been systematically drugged for months to create the very symptoms that justified my supposed need for care and supervision. "The dosage levels are particularly telling," Rachel explained during one of our conversations. "Whoever prescribed this combination knows exactly how to induce cognitive impairment while maintaining plausible deniability. This isn't the work of an amateur." Her investigation into Dr. Amanda Foster had yielded even more disturbing results. No physician by that name was licensed to practice in Oregon, Washington, or California. The office address Tom had given me corresponded to a vacant commercial space that had been empty for over a year. The medical license number on the supposedly official documents in my file belonged to a pediatrician in Maine who had no knowledge of my case and no connection to anyone in Oregon. But perhaps most significantly, Rachel had identified Tom's primary accomplice. The mysterious S from his text messages was Stephanie Brooks, a 32-year-old woman who worked as a loan officer at Millfield Community Bank. Rachel had traced their relationship back almost 2 years through credit, card records, and surveillance footage from local establishments. More damning still, Stephanie had recently applied for a marriage license in Nevada under an assumed name, listing Tom as her fiancé despite his current marital status. "She's not just helping him steal your money," Rachel told me during a particularly difficult phone call. "She's planning to be his new wife once you're out of the picture. The timeline suggests they intended to have you declared incompetent within the next few months, then use medical grounds to have you institutionalized permanently." The words hit me like physical blows. Institutionalized permanently. They hadn't just been planning to steal my inheritance and run away together. They had been working toward a scenario where I would disappear from society entirely, locked away in some facility where my protests about fraud and conspiracy would be dismissed as the delusions of a mentally ill woman. The scope of their planning became clearer as Rachel continued her investigation. Tom had already begun the legal groundwork for having me declared incompetent, consulting with attorneys who specialized in elder law and guardianship proceedings. He had compiled medical records documenting my supposed decline, financial statements, showing my inability to manage money responsibly, and character references from people who had observed my confused and erratic behavior. Jessica's role in the conspiracy remained unclear but troubling. Rachel's investigation suggested that my daughter genuinely believed I was suffering from early-onset dementia, but her nursing background had made her a credible witness to my symptoms and an effective advocate for the medical narrative Tom was constructing. Whether she was an innocent victim of manipulation or a willing participant in the fraud would depend on how much she actually knew about the fake medications and non-existent doctor. On the 4th day of my exile, Rachel called with news that changed everything. "Linda, we need to meet in person," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "I've uncovered something that puts you in immediate danger, and we need to act quickly." An hour later, I sat across from Rachel in a different coffee shop, this one in a town I'd never visited before. Her usually composed demeanor was strained, and she wasted no time getting to the point. "Tom has filed a missing person report with the Millfield Police," she began. "He's claiming that you're suffering from dementia and are dangerous to yourself. He's obtained a temporary emergency guardianship order that gives him legal authority to make medical decisions on your behalf, if you're found." The implications were staggering. If the police found me, they would return me to Tom's custody, where he would have legal authority to have me committed to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. Once I was institutionalized, even temporarily, it would be much harder to prove that I was mentally competent and had been the victim of fraud rather than the perpetrator of confused accusations. "There's more," Rachel continued. "I've been monitoring Tom's communications, and he's been in contact with a private security firm that specializes in locating missing persons. He's not just relying on local police to find you. He's hired professionals. The net was closing around me with frightening efficiency. Tom's public face of the concerned husband searching for his confused wife was providing perfect cover for a manhunt designed to silence me before I could expose his crimes. We need to go on the offensive," Rachel said. "Hiding and gathering evidence isn't enough anymore. We need to create a situation where Tom exposes himself publicly, where his true nature becomes undeniable to everyone who matters." She outlined a plan that was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Instead of continuing to hide from Tom, we would arrange a controlled confrontation in a public setting where his reactions could be recorded and witnessed. The goal was to provoke him into revealing his true knowledge of the conspiracy while creating undeniable evidence of his guilt. "It's dangerous," Rachel acknowledged. "If he realizes what we're doing, he could become violent or find ways to turn the situation against you. But it's also our best chance to gather the kind of evidence that will hold up in court and protect you from future manipulation." The plan required multiple moving parts and precise timing. Carol would fly in from Phoenix, ostensibly to help search for me, but actually to serve as a witness and ally during the confrontation. Rachel would position herself and recording equipment in strategic locations to capture everything that happened. I would reveal myself to Tom in a public setting, forcing him to react spontaneously to my accusations without time to prepare his usual careful responses. The location Rachel had chosen was Memorial Park in downtown Millfield, a central gathering place that would ensure plenty of witnesses while providing multiple escape routes if things went wrong. The timing would be Saturday morning during the weekly farmers market, when the park would be crowded with families and community members who knew both Tom and me personally. "The key is to stay calm and stick to the facts," Rachel instructed, as we finalized our preparations. "Don't let him deflect or gaslight you. Present your evidence clearly and let his reactions speak for themselves. Remember, this isn't about convincing him of anything. It's about revealing his true character to the community that has trusted him for decades." Friday night, I checked into a different motel closer to Millfield, preparing for what would either be my liberation or my final defeat. Carol arrived that evening, flying into Portland and driving down to meet me. Seeing my sister after months of isolation was overwhelming, and I broke down sobbing in her arms as soon as she walked into my motel room. "I'm so sorry I didn't see this sooner," she whispered as she held me. "I should have trusted my instincts when Tom started limiting my contact with you." "You couldn't have known," I told her, though part of me wondered what might have happened if Carol had pushed harder against Tom's explanations for my unavailability. He was very good at making everything seem reasonable and caring. That night, we stayed up late reviewing the evidence Rachel had gathered and rehearsing the confrontation that would take place the next morning. Carol would approach Tom at Côte des Fées, the farmer's market, expressing concern about my disappearance and offering to help with the search. Her presence would seem natural given our close relationship, but it would also serve to draw Tom into a public conversation where I could appear and present my accusations. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn day that brought out large crowds for Millfield's popular farmers market. I positioned myself at the edge of the park with a clear view of the market stalls, while Rachel took her place with recording equipment disguised as casual shopping gear. Carol entered the market area and began looking for Tom, who was easy to spot moving through the crowd with the focused energy of a man conducting a search operation. When Carol approached him, Tom's relief was visible even from my distant vantage point. He embraced her warmly, the picture of a grateful brother-in-law accepting help from concerned family. They talked for several minutes, Tom presumably updating Carol on the search efforts and police investigation. Then, following our planned script, Carol mentioned that she had received a phone call from someone claiming to have seen me in the area. That was my cue. I emerged from my hiding place and walked directly toward them, my heart pounding but my resolve steady. Tom saw me approaching before Carol did, and the expression that crossed his face in that unguarded moment was everything we had hoped to capture. Not relief or joy at finding his missing wife, but something much darker. Calculation. Anger. Fear. "Linda," he said as I drew closer, his voice carefully modulated to project concern and relief for the benefit of the growing crowd around us. "Thank God you're safe. We've been so worried about you." "Have you?" I asked, stopping just out of his reach and speaking loudly enough for nearby market-goers to hear. "Or have you been worried about what I might tell people about Dr. Foster and the medications you've been giving me?" Tom's face went through a series of rapid changes as he processed my words and realized that this wasn't the confused, medicated woman he expected to find. The crowd around us was beginning to pay attention, drawn by the obvious tension in our interaction. "Sweetheart, you're confused," he said, reaching out as if to guide me away from the public space. "Dr. Foster has been helping you, and your medications are prescribed for your condition. Let's go home and talk about this privately." "Dr. Foster doesn't exist," I said clearly, pulling out copies of the documents Rachel had provided. "There's no physician by that name licensed in Oregon. The office address you gave me is an empty building. And these medications," I held up the pill bottles I'd taken from our house, contain drugs designed to cause confusion and memory loss, not treat them. The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by what was clearly becoming a public confrontation between a well-known community member and his wife. I recognized faces from church, from Jessica's school events, from decades of life. In this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Tom's mask was slipping, his carefully constructed persona of the concerned husband beginning to crack under the pressure of public scrutiny and unexpected accusations. Linda, this is exactly the kind of paranoid delusion that Dr. Foster warned us about. You're having an episode and you need medical attention. Then call her, I challenged, holding out my phone. Call Dr. Foster right now, and let's all talk to her together. Tom reached for the phone, but his hand hesitated as he realized the trap I'd laid for him. He couldn't call a doctor who didn't exist, but refusing to make the call would raise questions about why he wouldn't want to resolve the situation immediately. This isn't the place for this discussion, he said finally, his voice taking on an edge that several people in the crowd seemed to notice. You're not thinking clearly, and you're creating a scene that's embarrassing for both of us. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, I replied. Ever since I stopped taking the medications you and Stephanie Brooks have been giving me. At the mention of Stephanie's name, Tom's composure finally shattered completely. His face contorted with anger and something that looked like panic, and for a moment, the mask fell away entirely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. You don't know what you're talking about, he snarled, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that was still audible to the crowd. Stephanie is a colleague who's been helping me manage your care. If you keep making these accusations, you're going to force me to have you committed for your own safety. The threat was exactly what Rachel had hoped to provoke, a clear indication that Tom's concern for my well-being was actually about controlling and silencing me. Several people in the crowd were now openly staring and listening, and I could see some of them beginning to record the confrontation on their phones. Carol stepped forward then, her voice carrying clearly across the growing circle of spectators. Tom, if Linda is having delusions about her medical care, why don't we contact her doctor together and clear this up right now? I'd like to speak with Dr. Foster myself and understand what's happening with my sister's treatment. Tom's eyes darted between Carol and me, calculating his options and finding them all problematic. He couldn't produce a doctor who didn't exist, couldn't explain medications that weren't legitimate, and couldn't maintain his facade of innocent concern while making threats about forced commitment. This is ridiculous, he said finally, his voice rising with frustration. I don't have to justify Linda's medical care to a crowd of strangers. She's clearly having a psychiatric emergency, and I'm calling for an ambulance. He pulled out his phone and began dialing, but I was ready for this move as well. Before you do that, I said, producing the photographs I'd taken of his notebook and text messages, maybe you should explain these to everyone. I held up the images of his handwritten documentation of my supposed symptoms, the clinical observations, of confusion and memory loss that he'd been recording for months. Then I showed the crowd the text messages with Stephanie, discussing medication dosages and compliance, financial timelines, and isolation protocols. This is my husband's handwriting, I announced to the growing crowd. These are his text messages with his girlfriend, discussing how to drug me and document my decline so they can steal my inheritance and have me committed to an institution. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and electric. Gasps, angry, murmurs, and the sound of multiple phones being activated to record what was clearly becoming a major scandal in their small community. Tom looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him and seemed to realize for the first time that his carefully constructed reputation was crumbling in real time. Those are private communications taken out of context, he said desperately. Linda broke into my phone and has been misinterpreting innocent conversations about her care. Then let's call Stephanie Brooks and ask her to explain them, Carol suggested loudly. I'm sure she'd be happy to clarify what she meant by increase the dosage gradually, and isolation protocols. Tom's face had gone pale, and sweat was visible on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He was trapped in a public confrontation that was being recorded by multiple witnesses, unable to produce the medical professionals he claimed were treating me, unable to explain the evidence of conspiracy and fraud I was presenting. That's when Rachel appeared, approaching our group with the confident stride of someone who belonged in the situation. "Mr. Morrison," she said, producing her identification. "I'm Rachel Torres, a private investigator working on behalf of Mrs. Morrison. I think we need to have a conversation about your relationship with Stephanie Brooks and the fraudulent medical documentation you've been creating." The appearance of a private investigator was the final blow to Tom's composure. He looked around at the crowd of neighbors and community members who had watched his public unmasking, realizing that his reputation and his schemes were both destroyed. "This is harassment," he said weakly. "Linda is mentally ill, and you're all enabling her delusions." "Then you won't mind coming down to the police station to discuss the matter officially," Rachel replied calmly. "I'm sure the authorities would be very interested in examining the evidence we've gathered about insurance fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." Over the next several hours, the carefully constructed web of lies that had trapped me for months unraveled completely. Tom was arrested on charges of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy after police discovered additional evidence at our house and his office. Stephanie Brooks was taken into custody at the bank where she worked, caught in the middle of transferring funds from accounts she wasn't authorized to access. The investigation revealed the full scope of their scheme, which had involved not just my inheritance but also insurance fraud related to Tom's business. Stephanie had been using her position at the bank to identify vulnerable clients with significant assets, while Tom used his reputation and professional connections to gain access to their finances. I was their most ambitious target, but I wasn't their first victim. Jessica's role in the conspiracy proved to be more complicated than anyone had expected. She had genuinely believed that I was suffering from dementia, but her nursing education had been exploited by Tom and Stephanie to provide medical credibility to their fraud. The fake medications and documentation had been convincing enough to fool even a healthcare professional who wanted to believe that her father was acting in her mother's best interests. The reunion with my daughter was painful and complex, filled with tears and recriminations and gradual understanding. Jessica had been manipulated as well, her love for both of us twisted into a weapon against me. The trust between us would take time to rebuild, but the foundation of genuine care remained intact beneath the layers of deception and betrayal. The legal proceedings stretched on for months, but the evidence Rachel had gathered was overwhelming. Tom eventually accepted a plea agreement that resulted in a 7-year prison sentence, while Stephanie received 5 years for her role in the conspiracy. The stolen funds were recovered and returned to their rightful owners, including the inheritance that had been the original target of their scheme. As for me, I discovered that freedom from gaslighting and systematic manipulation was like recovering from a long illness. My mind cleared gradually as the effects of the medications wore off, and I began to remember who I had been before Tom's campaign to destroy my sense of reality. The process was sometimes difficult, as I had to confront how completely I had been deceived and how close I had come to losing everything that mattered to me. But there were also unexpected gifts in the aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure. The courage I had found to fight back against my abusers led to new confidence in other areas of my life. I returned to school to complete the master's degree in art history that I had abandoned decades earlier, finally pursuing the intellectual interests that Tom had always discouraged. I moved to a smaller house closer to Carol, strengthening the family relationships that had been deliberately damaged by isolation and manipulation. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own perceptions and memories again, to value my own judgment, and resist the kind of subtle control that had nearly destroyed me. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. 6 months after Tom's arrest, I stood in my new garden, planting bulbs that would bloom in the spring. The simple act of planning for the future, of believing that I would be there to see the flowers grow, felt like a profound victory over the people who had tried to steal not just my money, but my entire sense of self. Jessica visited that afternoon, bringing coffee and the tentative beginning of a conversation about rebuilding our relationship. We sat in my new kitchen, a space untainted by memories of manipulation and control, and talked honestly about what we had both lost and what we hoped to recover. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening to you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was helping you, but I was just making everything worse." "You were manipulated too," I told her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "The important thing is that we both see the truth now, and we have the chance to build something real together." As the sun set over my new neighborhood, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from desperation to freedom. The woman who had stood in her kitchen watching her phone shatter on the floor had felt powerless and trapped, doubting her own sanity and isolated from everyone who might have helped her. But that same woman had found the courage to fight back, to trust her instincts despite months of gaslighting, and to build the alliance that ultimately saved her life. The phone that had been destroyed that night had represented more than just communication technology. It had been my connection to the outside world, to the people who loved me and the reality that existed beyond Tom's carefully constructed lies. When Jessica smashed it on the kitchen floor, she had unknowingly been participating in my final silencing, the last step in a plan to cut me off from everyone who might have questioned my supposed decline. But destroying that phone had also been a catalyst. The moment when I finally understood that I was not sick or confused, but trapped and manipulated. The sound of the screen shattering had awakened something in me that months of drugs and gaslighting hadn't been able to destroy completely. The certainty that what I was experiencing wasn't right, and the determination to do something about it. Now, sitting in my new home with my daughter beginning to find her way back to me, I thought about all the women who might be experiencing similar manipulation and abuse. How many were being told that their perceptions were unreliable, their memories faulty, their concerns the product of mental illness rather than legitimate observations? How many were being isolated from family and friends who might help them see the truth? The experience had taught me that gaslighting and financial abuse could happen to anyone, regardless of education or intelligence or social standing. I had been a teacher, a professional woman with decades of experience reading people and situations, and I had still been systematically deceived by people I trusted. The manipulation had been so gradual and so carefully constructed that I had participated in my own silencing, accepting explanations that grew more implausible over time, because the alternative seemed unthinkable. But I had also learned that the human spirit was remarkably resilient, that even under sustained psychological assault, some part of us remained alert and observant, gathering evidence and waiting for the opportunity to fight back. The notebook, hidden behind my books, the secret phone calls to Carol, the careful documentation of discrepancies between my experiences and their explanations. All of it had been my subconscious mind's way of preserving the truth, even when my conscious thoughts were clouded by drugs and manipulation. Recovery had been a process of reclaiming not just my financial assets and legal autonomy, but my sense of self and my trust in my own judgment. It had meant learning to distinguish between appropriate caution and paralyzing suspicion, between reasonable requests for help and subtle attempts at control. Most importantly, it had meant rebuilding relationships with people who valued my independence rather than my compliance, who supported my growth rather than managing my decline. The TU. Legal victory had been important, but the personal transformation had been life-changing. I was no longer the woman who had accepted Tom's version of reality without question, who had trusted completely without verification, who had prioritized peace over truth. I was someone who asked hard questions, who demanded evidence, who trusted, but verified. As I prepared for bed in my new house, I thought about the letter I would write to other women who might be experiencing similar manipulation. I wanted them to know that their instincts were probably right, that confusion and memory problems that appeared suddenly might not be medical but manufactured. I wanted them to understand that the people who benefit most from your silence are often the ones who shouldn't be trusted with your secrets. Most importantly, I wanted them to know that it was possible to fight back, to reclaim their lives and their identities even after months or years of systematic abuse. The process was difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it was also liberating in ways that were impossible to imagine while trapped in the web of lies and manipulation. The woman who had vanished the day after her phone was destroyed had been afraid and confused, doubting her own sanity and desperately seeking help. The woman who had returned was stronger, wiser, and absolutely certain of her own worth and capabilities. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and it had ultimately led to a life that was more authentic and fulfilling than anything I had experienced before. Standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street where my new neighbors lived their ordinary lives, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. The betrayal and manipulation had been devastating, but they had also revealed truths about myself and my relationships that I might never have discovered otherwise. I was free now in ways that went far beyond legal and financial independence. I was free to be exactly who I was, to trust my own judgment, and to build a future based on my own choices rather than someone else's manipulation. The sound of my phone buzzing with a text message no longer triggered anxiety or dread. It was just a communication device, a tool for connecting with people who genuinely cared about my well-being. The message was from Carol, checking in on my first night in the new house and reminding me that I was loved and supported. I texted back a photo of my garden plans, sharing my hopes for the spring that would come and the flowers that would bloom in the soil I was finally free to tend. The conversation with Carol had ignited something inside me that months of systematic manipulation hadn't been able to extinguish completely. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the stirring of genuine hope, not the false reassurance that came from accepting Tom and Jessica's version of reality, but the real possibility that I could fight back and reclaim my life. But hope alone wouldn't be enough. I needed a plan. And more importantly, I needed to execute it without alerting Tom and Jessica to what I was doing. That evening, as I went through the motions of our normal routine, I began to truly observe my surroundings with the analytical mind that had served me well during my teaching career. Every interaction, every seemingly casual comment, every small detail of our household became data points in my investigation of my own life. The transformation was subtle but profound, like switching from being a passive participant in my own story to becoming its detective. Tom returned from his supposed late night at the office around 9:30, full of apologies about the Henderson insurance claim requiring extra attention. He kissed my forehead and asked about my day with the kind of solicitous concern that had once seemed loving but now felt calculated. I responded with the appropriate level of vague confusion, mentioning that I thought I'd spoken to Carol but wasn't sure if it had been today or yesterday. Tom's relief at my apparent disorientation was visible, confirming my growing suspicion that my confusion was exactly what he wanted to see. After Tom went to bed, I lay awake for hours, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. The house settled around us with its familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that had comforted me for decades, but now seemed ominous, as if the very walls were keeping secrets. When I was certain Tom was deeply asleep, I slipped out of bed and began my real work. The first step was documenting everything I could remember about the past few months, creating a timeline that I could compare against Tom and Jessica's version of events. I found an old composition notebook in my desk drawer, one left over from my teaching days, and began writing in careful, precise handwriting. Each entry was dated and detailed, describing not just what had happened, but how I had felt about it at the time and how those feelings had been dismissed or reframed by others. Writing it all down was both therapeutic and horrifying. Seeing the pattern laid out chronologically made the systematic nature of the manipulation undeniable. The incidents weren't random episodes of confusion scattered throughout normal life. They were carefully orchestrated events designed to build a case for my mental incompetence, each one documented and reinforced by the people I trusted most. The medication schedule became a particular focus of my investigation. Tom had taken over managing my pills months ago, explaining that the complex regimen prescribed by Dr. Foster required careful timing and coordination. Each morning, he would present me with a small paper cup containing various capsules and tablets, watching to ensure I swallowed them all. The routine had become so automatic that I'd stopped questioning what I was taking or why. Now, looking at the pill organizer on our bathroom counter, I realized I had no independent knowledge of what any of these medications were supposed to do. Tom had told me they were for memory support, anxiety management, and sleep regulation, but I had never seen the original prescriptions or spoken directly with a pharmacist about side effects or interactions. For all I knew, I could be taking anything. I carefully photographed each day's worth of pills with the small digital camera I'd kept hidden in my jewelry box, a device I'd purchased years ago for documenting student art projects but had forgotten about until now. The camera was old enough that it didn't connect to the internet, making it impossible for Tom to monitor my use of it through the household Wi-Fi system he'd set up to track our online activities. The photographs revealed something interesting that I hadn't noticed before. Several of the pills had markings and numbers that should have made them identifiable. But when I looked them up using the library computer during a supervised trip to town, I found discrepancies between what Tom told me they were and what the pharmaceutical databases indicated. The small blue capsules he claimed were for memory enhancement were actually listed as antihistamines with sedative properties. The white tablets supposedly prescribed for anxiety were identified as muscle relaxants that could cause confusion and disorientation in elderly patients. This discovery was simultaneously validating and terrifying. It confirmed my suspicion that I was being deliberately drugged to create symptoms of cognitive decline. But it also meant that Tom's deception was far more sophisticated than I had imagined. He wasn't just manipulating my environment and relationships. He was systematically altering my brain chemistry to make me compliant and confused, turning my own body against my ability to think clearly and defend myself. The fake medical records became my next target for investigation. Tom kept a file folder in his home office containing what he claimed were reports from Dr. Foster's office, documentation of my appointments and treatment progress that he reviewed regularly to track my condition. During one of his tennis games, I photographed every document in the folder, focusing particularly on the letterhead, contact information, and medical license numbers that should have identified Dr. Foster as a legitimate physician. The inconsistencies were immediately apparent to anyone looking with a critical eye. The letterhead design was generic, something that could be created with basic word processing software rather than the professional stationery used by established medical practices. The office address was listed without a suite number, unusual for a medical building where multiple practitioners typically shared space. Most telling of all, the medical license number format didn't match the pattern used by the Oregon Medical Board, a detail I was able to verify through online databases during my library visits. But perhaps the most damning evidence was the writing style of the supposed medical reports. After 30 years of reading student papers and parent communications, I had developed a keen sensitivity to voice and syntax patterns. The clinical notes allegedly written by Dr. Foster matched Tom's writing style too closely to be coincidental. The vocabulary choices, sentence structures, and even the subtle grammatical errors were consistent with documents I knew Tom had written. He hadn't just created a fake doctor. He had been writing my medical records himself, crafting a narrative of mental decline that existed only on paper. As my secret investigation continued, I began to understand the full scope of the control system that had been imposed on my life. The isolation from friends and family hadn't been random overprotectiveness, but a carefully calculated strategy to eliminate potential sources of reality checking. The financial management that Tom had assumed wasn't just about protecting me from my own confusion, but about preventing me from accessing resources that might enable me to seek independent help. Even my daily routines had been structured to maximize my dependence and minimize my autonomy. The supervised grocery trips that Jessica insisted were necessary for my safety also served to limit my contact with community members who might notice changes in my behavior or question my supposed diagnosis. The elimination of my solo activities, like book club meetings and volunteer work, hadn't just been about managing my energy levels, but about removing opportunities for me to maintain relationships that existed outside of Tom and Jessica's control. The psychological manipulation was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire scheme. Every expression of doubt or confusion on my part was immediately seized upon as evidence of my declining mental state, while any moments of clarity or accurate memory were dismissed as temporary improvements that shouldn't be trusted. The constant undermining of my perceptions had created a feedback loop where I began to doubt myself, even when I was right, second-guessing my own experiences until I lost confidence in my ability to distinguish between reality and confusion. But the more I investigated, the more I began to trust my own observations and conclusions. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable when viewed objectively. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being systematically deceived by the people I loved most, and they were using my love and trust as weapons against my sanity and independence. The financial aspects of the scheme became clearer as I pieced together fragments of information, from overheard phone conversations and documents I wasn't supposed to see. Tom's insurance business had been struggling for years as larger companies moved into our regional market, cutting into his client base and forcing him to reduce his fees to remain competitive. The stress of declining revenues had created pressure in our marriage that I had attributed to normal business cycles, but now I realized it might have been the catalyst for something far more desperate. My inheritance represented a level of financial security that Tom couldn't achieve through his own work, nearly $1 million that could solve all of his business problems and fund the comfortable retirement he'd always envisioned. But accessing that money required either my voluntary cooperation or legal authorization through a guardianship arrangement that would only be granted if I were declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. The timeline of my supposed mental decline corresponded almost exactly with the period when Tom's business pressures had intensified. The first incidents of forgetfulness and confusion had appeared shortly after he'd received notice that his largest commercial client was switching to a national insurance company, a loss that represented nearly 30% of his annual revenue. The escalation of my symptoms had accelerated as additional clients followed suit, leaving Tom's business on increasingly unstable financial ground. Understanding the financial motive behind the psychological manipulation added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Tom wasn't just stealing my inheritance. He was systematically destroying my mental health to justify the theft, turning me into a victim who would be unable to defend herself or seek justice even if she understood what was happening to her. But there was something else driving the scheme, something that went beyond simple financial desperation. The level of planning and coordination required to pull off such an elaborate deception suggested that Tom had been considering this approach for months, possibly years. The fake medical records, the systematic drugging, the careful documentation of manufactured symptoms, all of it indicated a level of premeditation that was chilling in its implications. During one of my late-night investigation sessions, I discovered evidence that Tom had been researching legal procedures for having someone declared mentally incompetent long before my symptoms had appeared. Hidden in his computer's browsing history were multiple visits to websites explaining guardianship laws, elder care regulations, and the process for obtaining emergency custody of an incapacitated adult. The research had begun over a year ago, suggesting that Tom had been planning this scheme since well before I began experiencing any actual confusion or memory problems. The discovery that my victimization had been planned so far in advance was devastating, but also clarifying. It meant that nothing about my recent experiences had been authentic, that every expression of concern from Tom and Jessica had been part of a performance designed to establish their credibility as my caregivers. But it also meant that I had been right to trust my instincts about the discrepancies and inconsistencies I'd noticed. My confusion hadn't been medical but manufactured, and my suspicions had been justified responses to real deception rather than paranoid delusions. As I gathered evidence and built my case, I began to develop a clearer picture of Jessica's role in the conspiracy. My daughter's nursing education had made her a particularly valuable ally for Tom, providing medical credibility to the fake diagnosis and treatment regimen that wouldn't have been convincing coming from a layperson. Jessica's genuine concern for my well-being had been exploited and redirected, turning her protective instincts into tools for monitoring and controlling my behavior. But I wasn't certain whether Jessica was a willing participant in the fraud or an innocent victim of Tom's manipulation. Her emotional reactions to my supposed decline seemed genuine, and her nursing background might have made her more susceptible to accepting a medical explanation for changes in my behavior. The distinction mattered because it would determine whether I could trust her with the truth about what I was discovering, or whether revealing my investigation would put me in additional danger. The decision to keep my investigation secret from Jessica was one of the most difficult aspects of the entire process. My daughter had been my closest confidant for most of her life, the person I turned to for emotional support and practical advice. The possibility that she might be actively working against me was heartbreaking, but the risk of revealing my discoveries to someone who might warn Tom was too great to ignore. Instead, I began testing Jessica's reactions to subtle probes about my medical care, watching for signs of genuine surprise or discomfort when I asked questions about Dr. Foster or my medication regimen. Her responses were troubling, but not conclusive. She seemed genuinely convinced that I was receiving appropriate medical care, but there were moments when her explanations seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous, as if she were reciting information she'd been given rather than expressing her own understanding. The uncertainty about Jessica's involvement added another layer of complexity to my escape planning. I needed to prepare for the possibility that my own daughter might try to prevent me from leaving or might immediately alert Tom to my disappearance. The thought of viewing Jessica as a potential adversary rather than an ally was almost unbearable, but my survival depended on realistic assessment of all possible threats to my safety and freedom. As the days passed and my secret investigation continued, I began to feel a growing sense of urgency about taking action. The longer I remained in Tom's house, taking his drugs and playing the role of the confused woman he needed me to be, the more evidence he could accumulate to support his case for having me declared incompetent. Every day of delay increased the risk that his scheme would succeed, leaving me permanently trapped in a system that would dismiss my protests as the delusions of a mentally ill woman. But I also understood that escaping without a plan would be worse than remaining trapped. Tom had legal, medical, and financial advantages that I couldn't overcome through impulse or desperation. My only chance of success lay in careful preparation, strategic alliances, and evidence that would be convincing to people who had no reason to doubt Tom's version of events. The phone call to Carol had been the first step in building those alliances, but it wasn't enough by itself. I needed professional help from people who understood the legal and medical systems that Tom was manipulating against me. I needed documentation that would stand up in court and witnesses who could testify to my mental competence. Most importantly, I needed to secure my financial assets before Tom could access them through fraudulent guardianship proceedings. The final piece of my preparation involved creating a secure method of communication that Tom couldn't monitor or intercept. The household internet connection, the landline phone, and even my cell phone were all potentially compromised, giving Tom the ability to track my communications and prevent me from reaching potential allies. I needed alternatives that would allow me to coordinate my escape and ongoing resistance without alerting him to my plans. During a supervised trip to the drugstore, I managed to purchase a prepaid cell phone with cash that I'd been gradually accumulating from household expenses. The phone was basic and cheap, designed for emergency use rather than regular communication, but it provided a secure connection to the outside world that Tom couldn't monitor through our regular service providers. I activated it using false information and hid it in the lining of an old purse that I kept in my bedroom closet, a location that Tom never had reason to search. The prepaid phone became my lifeline to freedom, a tool that allowed me to contact Carol and arrange for professional help without Tom's knowledge. But using it required extreme caution and careful timing, since any discovery of the device would immediately reveal the extent of my planning and potentially trigger defensive measures that might make escape impossible. With my evidence gathered, my allies contacted, and my communication secured, I was finally ready to execute the plan that would either restore my freedom or confirm my worst fears about the people I had trusted with my life. The decision to leave everything familiar and venture into an uncertain future was terrifying. But remaining trapped in a system designed to destroy my identity and autonomy was no longer tolerable. The woman who had stood in her kitchen watching her phone shatter on the floor had been confused and frightened, doubting her own perceptions and desperately seeking validation from people who were systematically deceiving her. But the woman, preparing to vanish the next day, was clear-minded and determined, armed with evidence and allies that would help her reclaim the life that had been stolen from her through manipulation and fraud. Tomorrow would bring either liberation or devastation, but at least it would bring the truth. And after months of living in a carefully constructed web of lies, the truth felt like the most precious thing in the world, worth any risk to obtain and defend. The sound of Tom stirring in his sleep reminded me that time was running out and discovery was always possible. I carefully returned my notebook to its hiding place, checked that my evidence was secure, and prepared for what might be my last night in the house where I had lived for nearly 3 decades. Whatever came next, I would face it with clear eyes and accurate memories, trusting my own judgment for the first time in months. The nightmare was almost over, but the real fight was about to begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.